excited to welcome everyone here. I'm Natalie Benamou, the founder and creator of Her C-Suite. Michele Brown is an expert in this space. She's principal and CEO of Into Action Coaching, LLC, a New Jersey-based executive coaching and talent management firm. Michele and her team of experienced and highly skilled subject matter experts in the fields of leadership development and cultural transformation. She's been doing this for more than 15 years, and she's a leader in this space, but also a lot of other topics. She's one of our key speakers in our turnkey speaker program, as well as she is one of our facilitators in our leadership development program. And it's my honor to welcome you, Michele, here today, and also Lydia Roan, who is our co-chair of Her C-Suite DEI Council, and she'll be leading the peer-to-peer facilitation. So thank you for being here, Michele and Lydia, and thank you for speaking today with us.
Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate it. Appreciate the invitation. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, really looking forward to this.
Yeah, we're going to get started, I think, with a conversation around this DEI idea. But for those of you, I know there's a few people that are coming in, so we'll just say real briefly what we do here at Her C-Suite turnkey speaker events. And I know that we have some amazing guests here today that have experienced our turnkey speaker events. We do leadership development, which includes mentorship, as well as executive leadership development, and our new Her C-Suite boards. So if you're in the C-Suite, or you are on a board and you want advice from other people, our Her C-Suite boards is the perfect complement to that. And it's a program that we include, as well as our exclusive programs. And that's what you're here today, which is our DEI Cross-Organization Council, inspired by women in our community, and also people that are leaders in DEI that have shared that they feel often siloed and they need to gain an outside perspective. So it's an inclusive community for HR leaders and DEI leaders. And we host a monthly program like today. So you're getting an experience. For those of you not in the program, we do have some of our members here who are in the DEI Council, but for those of you not familiar, we host a monthly event, and our secret plan of what we do at all of our programs is an executive level speaker followed by peer-to-peer conversations. And in the case of DEI Council, it includes one of our co-chairs who's an expert in this field and leads the conversation and gives you that outside perspective. So with that, I am going to start with a conversation with Michele Brown. Michele, I'm so thrilled to have this conversation, and it was inspired by your amazing newsletter, which inspires me every week. I highly recommend Michele's newsletter. We'll put it in the chat or send it out as a post to all of you, because her newsletter is phenomenal. So thanks, Michele, for being here today.
Thank you, Natalie. Appreciate it. Yeah, this is a great topic. I'm so excited to talk about it.
Yeah, I think especially, we were just talking at the beginning of this before we got started that the Lean In McKinsey report came out yesterday, and there's some startling data, and data really is what drives decisions behind the scenes. It's what gives you budget for your initiatives, and it's so important. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you. So we'll get started right now. And my first question is really, why is it so important when you're developing a DEIB strategy to have your data and know the data?
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to acknowledge that there's so many progressive organizations these days, thank goodness, that are putting a real strategic priority around creating a DEIB strategy. And what we're uncovering as consultants is how important data is, so that it's not just a, tick the box type of initiative, but, conventional wisdom states that every successful strategy really starts with data. And it's important to be able to sort of create methods by which you collect information, statistical information, and get the numbers, so that your strategy, whatever the initiatives are or objectives or goals that an organization wants to roll up in their strategy, is grounded in facts and not conjecture or theory. So that's why at this point, in order to have a real comprehensive DEIB strategy, being able to collect the data, and we're going to talk more about, then what, but it's just imperative to then, look at data in maybe three categories. One is people data. You want to know the demographics. You want to know sort of the engagement levels, what level of engagement or dissatisfaction your associates are in, and certainly what the skills. That's sort of in the people data. In the performance data category, it's really uncovering information from performance ratings, performance reviews, and collecting that even through succession programs and other types of assessment tools. And then the third category is program data. If, employee attendance, if there are such thing as affinity groups and employee resource groups, what's the level of attendance and engagement of those types of groups, and any sort of, outcome assignment. So being able to collect that data in those three different categories can tell you a lot about an organization, enabling you to kind of put your finger on the pulse of what's happening.
And, we were just talking, and I know I mentioned it earlier about the Lean In McKinsey report and the data, but sort of a little, it's not surprising, but a little disheartening, and knowing what outside sources are saying about the data. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why it's so important to know also, what is happening externally as you talk about those three categories?
You mean internal collection of data versus what's happening across the, yeah. So yeah, that enables an organization to really kind of benchmark, right? Because there's an expression that says, what is not measured cannot be managed. So you want to be able to sort of know where and how your organization fits in to within your industry or just society at large, and being able to extract from industry data, much of which is made available. For example, even the Lean In study, there's just so much information that can be gleaned off of the internet and any type of organization, trade organization that you may be affiliated or associated with, being able to sort of understand where the benchmarks are, or with what the statistics are. You can then compare your data against industry data, because at this point, it's important to be an employer of choice and have a competitive advantage. So you want to make sure that your strategy, for the most part, is aimed towards, the higher end of that goal, whether it's, increasing female leaders by X or women of color by Y, being able to sort of benchmark against the industry standard, and then publishing that information will help your organization be well positioned and branded as an employer of choice and an ideal place upon which to work.
And that kind of dovetails into transparency, and why is it so important for people to know? I think now we've progressed after the last 2 years, people are really wanting to know and being more forthright about information, asking, for example, salary and data like we're talking about. Why is that transparency so important to both the company, but also the employees, or for talent acquisition when they're trying to go out and find new talent?
Well, yeah, I mean, transparency and accountability, I think, are first cousins, right? So let's tackle the transparency. So it's imperative that an organization or the associates understand, especially, for example, if an employee survey, engagement survey has been conducted, they're answering these questions, and in their mind, they're saying, okay, now what? So being able to, perhaps as the committee, for example, may be pulling through all of that information and crafting a strategy. To some extent, it's keeping the organization and its associates informed of what is intended. You don't necessarily have to publish what we're going to do about it, but letting them know that this information is being studied and evaluated and, will culminate in a strategy. That's where the transparency, because it's imperative that they know that the information that they have shared is not going to be put on the shelf somewhere, and that at some point, and it needs to be timely, you want to be able to ensure that the communication of whatever that strategy is communicated, widely. But that level of transparency helps to ensure trust, because in order to retain your top talent, they need to know that the organization, again, has made it a priority and is really focused on making sure that, they're closing the gap. And in terms of accountability, That's really key as well. And how, collecting data is important. It's because I distill it down to how can hiring managers, for example, or department heads, division heads, et cetera, be held accountable. Once a DEI strategy has been put in place and it really sort of distills down to what our goals are to hire, develop and retain talent, I honestly, as a consultant, we often advise our clients that hiring managers and individuals who are responsible for people, leaders of others, managers of others, even as part of their performance objectives and what they're evaluated on, should have specific, SMART goals tied to what the strategy intends. So whether it's about promotions, whether it's about attracting and retaining talent, I think somehow tying it into what their performance objectives are in some way that, again, is legal and is in compliance with, the EOC guidelines, as well as potentially how their meritorious increases or their bonuses are calculated. Because again, what cannot be measured cannot be managed. There are a lot of well-intended managers that will sort of shake their head and recognize that they are ultimately responsible for ensuring that those goals are achieved. But I truly believe that if they don't have skin in the game in terms of what they're going to be held accountable for, sometimes it can just be a bit of a slippery slope, and those goals aren't necessarily achieved. So that's where I believe the accountability comes into place. And also, when it comes to an organization communicating the DEIB strategy to its board, if they have it, or its group of advisors, so that, again, you have another governing body that is overseeing and being an accountability partner to ensure that the strategic objectives for year one or, up to year 3 are really sort of adhered to. So yeah, I think that that's a way for an organization at large to be held accountable.
I think, there's the statistics about, and, Warren Buffett has said famously about how companies do better when there's women in the C-suite, and not just the token person, like you were saying, and checking the box off, but broadly, and being able to use this data to show the bottom line and the business case, right, of how, so you've got the data, you're collecting it for employees and attracting employees and retaining the employees, but the business case is that companies do better when there's a diverse group of employees. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how that data can be used? Because I think that ultimately does drive some of those decisions, being able to tie it to when we have a diverse population, we're able to achieve a much better outcome financially for the company.
Yeah, well, everything, ultimately impacts or can impact the bottom line, right? So the first thing, and it's equally important for an organization to have a consciousness, but it's also, right, important for an organization to recognize that it does have a positive impact to the bottom line. And here's what we've been able to uncover, a number of things. One is, regardless of the industry or area that your business may be in, one thing that is appealing, whether you're a manufacturer providing a product or, providing a service, you want your organization to look like your customer or client base, because it's a highly competitive market at this point. And subsequently, believe it or not, when people are potentially looking to either buy your services or acquire your goods, they are very educated at this point, well-informed, and they may be making their buying decisions based on how well your organization is represented by the group that they may represent. So that's, important for an organization to kind of really realize. The other is, even from a vendor perspective, I find a lot of organizations have sort of a 2-tier approach in terms of, yeah, we want to close the gap in terms of potentially how many women we have at, leadership positions, but also recognizing what is our supplier or vendor profile look like? Are we ensuring that we are offering opportunities for outside vendors? And again, that can all sort of attribute to the bottom line and making sure that an organization has a bit of a competitive advantage.
And as you think about, kind of packaging all of this up and you're now ready, you're taking in the information, what are some ways that companies can use it internally? And then also, we talked a little bit about comparing outside of the organization. What are some of the tactics that companies should be using for this data and staying abreast of what's happening out in the marketplace?
Okay, so if I understand the question, it's once the data is collected, how should it be used? Okay, so across the board, it's to look at it sort of through two lenses. The first is, let's look at our demographic profile and make sure that we are starting from the end and working backwards. And what I mean by that is, if whatever the percentage is, for example, of male leaders, what is it? So we're looking at what the data tells us about what the current situation is, and then perhaps comparing it to industry standards and looking to say, okay, so what do we need to do in order to promote or advance or hire more women or people of color, or, again, of course, different demographics. Let's make sure that our representation of our leadership is really matched. So it's looking at what I call the personal or physical aspects of an organization. The second part is sort of the not so visual aspects of an organization, and that is, let's look to see what our level of engagement, what's the status of sort of the morale, what's the attitude of our associates. If they are leaving in droves, or what we now hear the term quiet quitting, to where their performance is just kind of, flatlined and subpar, well, we need to look at ultimately where it needs to be, because that ties into potential succession planning, and then use the data in order to determine what we need to do differently or better, not only to acquire, but once we have the people, what do we need to do in order to ensure that they are fully engaged after we, uncover, where the disengagement is? Are we not offering flexibility? Are we not, especially for women, not to go off on a tangent, but, we do a lot of work within organizations around mentorship and employee resource groups. And the rallying cry for so many women within organizations is that companies have not really stepped up to be progressive enough to recognize that their needs around flexibility, around certainly, advancement, are really kind of slow to happen. So again, it's testing the attitudes and the behaviors and the mindset of your associates. So again, you can figure out what you need to do differently or better to, again, attract and retain them.
And once you have that information, I know you and I did a podcast about executive sponsorship. And I think that's one of the key components of the data. Like, once you have that data, you have to have champions within the organization, and it can't just be the one person, but you need to be able to go across. But certainly you need a sponsor that's going to help give you visibility, regardless of your role, whether you're in the C-suite and you want allies in the C-suite, or you're, a rising leader or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that? About how do you get and win buy-in once you have this information and you want to you're armed now with the data to either say, we need to go in this direction, or here's what we're doing well, here's what we need to improve. How does one get the buy-in from there? Okay, so if I'm understanding your question, there's sort of two aspects to it. So how do you get the buy-in from senior leadership to ensure that they are supporting this, both with accountability as well as with financial investments, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think I also hear you ask about potentially what the role is of a program such as a sponsorship program, how that can also benefit from your data to ensure. Okay, so my experience has been, it's interesting. Senior leaders, I mean, they just have to have a passion
for the work that they do. And I know that sounds very general, but what I mean by that is you have some senior leaders, CEOs, presidents, division heads that have not necessarily, they kind of buy into it theoretically, but literally aren't ready to really put the real action and support, and especially financially, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And honestly, this is where we believe to some extent that there should be some accountability based on what they're evaluated on. Now, a CEO is not necessarily going to be going through a performance, appraisal process. However, there's got to be some accountability so that if they're lukewarm and aren't necessarily putting their whole heart into the strategies, then there's got to be something that sort of pushes them and makes the needle move. There are a lot of companies, thank goodness, this is what we're experiencing, that's changed because you have a lot of senior leaders now that have a heart, and because they are potentially or have experienced a massive migration of key associates leaving, women, people of color, that's when it really impacts them. Because if it does not enable us to meet our numbers, to hit our goals, and sales are declining or market share is being decreased because of the fact that we no longer have quote unquote butts in the seats, well, then that's a wake-up call. So even though they may not have sort of the consciousness of this is a good thing to do, all of a sudden, when it hits the bottom line, all of a sudden they'll have a bit of a wake-up call. So I don't know how else to kind of define it other than the accountability piece, as well as being a conscious leader, a purpose-driven leader. And in terms of a sponsorship program, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because as consultants, we are uncovering that sponsorship programs, in addition to mentorship programs, which historically, have been well in place in a lot of organizations, have become key programs within a DEI strategy. Why? Because, when we think about what a mentorship program does, a mentorship program, pairs you with a experienced leader, and it's their sharing of perhaps their experiences that helps the mentor kind of, navigate politically, understand exactly what their unique value propositions are, what they can contribute to an organization, and to ensure that they're, visible. A sponsor takes it to another nth degree, because the sponsor is truly a well-positioned senior leader with a lot of credibility, and is putting their reputation on the line by advocating, opening up doors, validating for a protege's experience and potential. And historically, right, we as women, we know that men have always that's the boys club, whether they're playing golf or they just kind of have that network within an organization. They've usually had that formal or informal sponsor. And now putting those types of more formal programs in place is now what's available to, people of color, as well as women, to literally partner them with someone who's going to really dedicate their time and, again, put their credibility on the line to part the seas and truly look to clear the runway, so to speak, for a protege to be given, exposure, and to have someone whose reputation and position within the company is well respected enough that it boosts that protege's value. Yeah, so that's how that has become a very key program within DEIB to overcome the gaps that may exist in terms of the limited and unrepresented groups.
I want to open it up to our audience now for questions, because I could talk to you all day, as you know, but I don't want to be the only voice here. So I'd love to open it up to our audience and ask a question If you have a question for Michele specifically, we're going to be then kicking it off into our peer-to-peer conversations, but about the things that Michele has been sharing, what comes to mind in terms of your organization? What are some things that you're facing that you might have a question about data and how you're using it? Does anyone, otherwise I'll call on you. I'll do a Kathy Scala and call on you, so. So does anyone have questions? You can put it in the chat or you can ask a question. There's Christina. Hey, Christina.
Hi, Michele, I've got a question for you. So my organization, we're located in Colorado in the United States, and it's not known for being a diverse state. And so we've gotten a bunch of data and we collect a ton of data, but what the data shows is that we're better than our regional representation. And so I'm a little concerned about that data because I think it will, if it's exposed to the rest of the organization, will show that like, oh, we're good, we're done, we're all set here. What would your advice be when you have, met the, like our local census in Colorado, the percent Black, percent Asian, we've met that. We match our local population. What would your advice be so that we don't take the foot off the gas for DE&I?
Yeah, well, first off, congratulations, right, for having, such sort of successful numbers. I mean, I think that there are, off the top of my head, there are other categories to sort of take a look at. When we talk about intersectionality, in whatever way you sort of measure what's happening around the LGBTQ, how that compares, right, to sort of the community at large. So it's looking at what other, again, categories that can be measured where you may not necessarily be at it or above it. The other is, even if the categories that have been measured, you're exceeding sort of what the representation is, it's still okay to continue to raise the bar, right? Because, just because we are now matching against the benchmark doesn't necessarily mean that we can now rest our laurels and feel like, okay, our work is done. Again, the other third category is, and it may not be measured against external data, but what I mentioned earlier about the attitude and the engagement level. So there's always areas to kind of peek behind the curtain and peel back to kind of see where does a continued improvement need to be made. Some of it will be compared to external, and some of it is just how can we ensure that we maintain our levels and continue to increase them. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
And I just wanted to add, Michele, I thought you brought up a really important point earlier, is that you want to also reflect your customer population. So Christina, you might feel like you've met the kind of goals within your affirmative action plan, that you match employee to the the groups around you, but what about your customer base? What is your customer base? And are you reflecting or wanting to reflect your organization to what that could be?
No, that's a great point, because I mean, and when I say we've met our goals, like Colorado is 4% Black population, and so that's not a great number, but that's our number, right? And so, no, this is some great perspective. Yeah, we're very much a global organization, so the population is much different than what you'd see in Colorado of our patients.
And I would imagine, just to kind of couple on that, there's, in terms of the ethnic groups, what's the majority? I mean, it may be white, but isn't, I think Native American is a pretty significant, so again, whether it's within your organization in terms of employees and associates, but also to Lydia's point, if non-whites are, or other non-people of color represent a significant percentage of your client or customer base, are you sort of matching that within your organization? Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Anika has a great point, and she says there's measuring diversity, but there's also measuring inclusion, which may, which some may argue is more critical as the next frontier of measurement. What are your thoughts on that? Measuring inclusion, especially as it relates to what Christina was saying about inclusion, sort of as opposed to only looking at diversity.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point, because yeah, we're talking a lot about diversity as part of the DEIB strategy, but inclusion is key, because the distinction there is how included, and that's sometimes attitudinal, behavioral. Do your associates feel like their individuality is being appreciated and valued? Yeah, so there's sometimes a whole different set of standards and initiatives that can look to address, to ensure that inclusion is happening, in addition to the more physical aspects of diversity.
Here today, I want to thank our speakers, Lydia and Michele, for being here with us today. Wonderful conversation, great to hear from you, and hopefully you all got an idea of how we have facilitated conversation, expert speakers, we bring it all together so that you can continue to shine the light out in the world today.